Mr. Elder.
Hi, I also am time bound by my laptop.
You are.
I'm time bound by my laptop battery.
Oh.
Today has been interesting.
Happy Monday.
Lots of meetings, and also everyone's like, "Oh, so I guess KubeCon is canceled, but also maybe we're trying to rework the contributor summit or something." I don't know.
What, for EMEA or Shanghai?
Yeah, for you.
Amsterdam.
Yeah, the officially is not canceled, but like my employer Google just like canceled all travel and
Same here.
it's like it's done. So
Yeah.
also I was discussing folding this meeting into SIG testing, which actually hasn't had agenda items in a while, and this one's been kind of like infrequentish, like as things have gotten more stable, more
Sure.
discussions on issues and stuff. So
well, yeah, I'm seeing, I'm like, well, I'm the only one in here and there's no ongoing calendar of invites. I'm like, things must be stable.
yeah, they're like stable enough, and the remaining things that people want are usually like they're much more than like a Zoom call. They're like, I'd like clusters to, just magically pop back when I reboot. And the doing that is going to be a like involved change, not just to like, oh, we'll hash this out in like 5 minutes in a video call.
Gotcha. Well, I appreciate you making the time here anyway, even if it's just you and I. We can talk about the issue I filed.
Yeah.
I'm sure you had some background context over it with Duffy.
Yeah, we'd actually been discussing the idea intermittently for a while. I definitely think it's a cool idea to approach. I think I mentioned most of the stuff in the issue, like that. So we won't be able to like switch everything to CRI.
Sure.
Like a bunch of things don't even implement it. In fact, it pretty much is Podman and Cryo and Containerd that implement it, and it's also actually alpha, which is fun. And until very recently, Dims and I had fixed this. It was you could only get the API by like forking Kubernetes. It's at least staged now for like the API spec, but so
it seems like it makes a gigantic bundle at the end of the day.
Yeah, so I think what we should probably try to do here is leverage KrikeCuddle. KrikeCuddle also has some nice things like it has its own config that's well known. So like which endpoint do I use and stuff. So we don't have to like reinvent the wheel there. It should look pretty similar to like the Docker one or the Podman one, except we'll have to write like cryo spec or CRI spec like pod JSON or something for each node, because KrikeCuddle run is not a nice like tons of flags. You do this, do that. We have to like give it a spec, but that should actually make things mostly easier for us, and we shouldn't actually even need their library for that because despite being alpha, that like they're pretty wary of doing any major changes to the types, and if they do, we're going to need to dispatch over versions anyhow. So
it's kind of business as
usual. The API, the libraries are all the Kubernetes libraries are like, so you imported at a version. Oh, you wanted two? Nope. you make two binaries or something. So we can make n binaries by having n KrikeCuddle binaries, and I think that should work fine. Duffy was also mentioning the network stuff. I don't think that's going to be a blocker so much as with Docker, we're probably going to have to start leveraging some of its network quirks to fix like host reboot and stuff. So it's just going to have to be like Docker, and then everything else is just going to be like, you make a container, it gets a random IP, we find out what the IP is, and then before we like bring up Kubernetes, we coordinate that everything knows, okay, these are the IPs. We're going to probably move away from that in the Docker backend specifically, because there's no way with any of these to not have the IPs get randomized again when you like restart the machine or something. And then that just breaks everything because everyone's like, oh, I'm talking to this endpoint. Oh, it's not there. Whereas with Docker, it looks like with some hacks, we should be able to actually use some magic DNS that knows which container is what, and I looked at a couple ways we could like implement this ourselves, but it's pretty messy. So like we like we could try to like run our own DNS that's like aware of the containers or something, but getting all the network right is pretty full. So I think it's fine. I think for probably the cases where you're going to do something like Duffy was talking about, like Containerd API implemented against like vSphere VMs or something like that. For that sort of thing, I don't think you're going to be doing like machine reboot or changing IPs or whatnot. So it kind of still mostly targeting ephemeral test clusters. We just want to like be able to upgrade the case a little bit for all the people who are using Docker locally. We should be able to set restart on the container and use like DNS. And we don't have any weird environmental stuff there actually then, because it's actually fixed in Docker. And then that also solves some of the awkward issues with like if you're using like Docker for Mac, then like if you have like a loopback proxy on the host, then how does the container actually get it? Oh, well, it all just goes through this magic one that Docker sets up itself, and then we don't have to worry about it. So there's going to be a little bit of disjointedness there, but I don't think it should be too bad. And we do intend to try to keep the Podman functional for now. And we are looking at like Ignite maybe, pretty much anything that lets us take a Docker image and run it. We're looking at as like, would this be useful? And Ignite is interesting because it's VMs.
What's Ignite? I'm not familiar with that.
It's a project from Weave. It's kind of a lot.
Oh, Weave Ignite. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so it's changed a lot since I last had time to play with it. So I'm not sure how much it fits today, but the idea of like, okay, but actually we get quick VMs is pretty nice. So we may do something like that as well. And I think that also may or may not actually be CRI, but as long as we're like showing out, it doesn't really add any binary weight, and like it won't be fully supported probably at first, but it's there.
Okay. Well, that makes sense, and that's a very similar sort of a use case to what we're trying to do here. So in particular, on the product, one of the product managers for Fusion and Workstation, right? And what we did was we actually ported Containerd to the Mac, and we're sort of making sure that we adhere to the spec and we play nice there. So from our perspective, it's like if we can get the CRI plugin to work, and then Kind can leverage the CRI plugin, then there's like a happy fitting of together there. But so one of the questions that we had was, do we focus more on making that CRI plugin compatible, or should we focus more on like getting a CryCuddle story working better? And we didn't think we got an answer on that yet, but curious your thoughts.
Yeah, and so like anything that, I mean, from Kind's perspective, what we'd like to do is invoke a client binary that has all the details of like, how do I talk to the API and stuff, and just has a, like fairly simple set of commands for like list and whatnot. And so both CTR and CryCuddle offer that. We'd be pretty fine adding like a CTR one. I mean, it wouldn't really be any different from like, we have a special Podman one. As much as Podman wants to claim it's Docker compatible, it's not quite. So like we already today have like, there is code for like invoking Podman and handling that properly. And those interfaces may change a little bit, but they're fairly straightforward. We need to be able to label things as belonging to a cluster by name and then list for them. And we need to do a few things like find out the IP address of the container or like run a command in it. And then there's one pretty nebulous function that takes the spec for a cluster and actually makes the containers exist. That one's a bit gnarly, but it at least means that like whatever you do to make that happen, do not care, just like make it happen.
Yeah, just accept this file, and then when it's done, give me an okay return or not.
Right, and then after that, other code can be like, okay, I want to list the nodes for the cluster and get handles to them and like exec and stuff, and that's about it. It's pretty simple.
Let's go. We've done a lot of the plumbing, so I feel like we're we have some options here. Go ahead.
I'm gonna run for my charger.
Oh. Sure. And hopefully the Zoom mania doesn't end by the time he gets back. safe.
Okay. Yeah.
So in thinking about it, then maybe it sort of makes sense for us to focus on either CTR or CryCuddle, and we can get that out sort of on our side pretty quickly. And then we put it together a longer term plan that says, how do we sort of use a lower level provider like the CRI plugin? Or does that not make sense?
I'm not sure what is lower level. I think those should actually work pretty fine. I think the only thing that might get weird is like if it's like say we actually target Containerd directly. I could imagine someone having something like regular container supported and then also like magic containers using runtime class or something. Or so like I could see like if I were building something like this, I might say, oh, you have to like opt into this runtime class so you can have like hybrid nodes, in which case somehow we need to tell kind that we want this. I don't know what that is supposed to look like, but otherwise, like, I mean, kind doesn't care too much about it at that level of detail. It just wants to create containers running this image, and it has a bunch of parameters for that. But almost all of the parameters are up to the provider. So, like, if you know your provider is a VM, you may not even need to do all of these mounts and things. And the other thing that a provider can do is say, oh, well, since I'm doing VMs off in vSphere, I can't, bind mount to the host. So any extra host mounts, if I see that in config, I'm just going to throw an error during provision. I'm kind of expecting that, like, if we do Kata Firecracker at some point, that will be the case even locally. Like, you just can't do bind mounts. So we'll just reject the config with an error, and it's fine, and it's high level.
Just proceed, right?
Right, and then all of the rest of it, all it cares about is I need to know like where this thing is, like how do I talk to it, and I need to know I want to run a command inside this machine. Right now it's assuming it's root, but like sure, because it's some throwaway node somewhere, and it's going to run things like kubeatom. So and some other straightforward stuff. It'll run a couple of kubectl commands. It'll probe some stuff. It might grab logs. All of those things are actually set up in a way that as long as you can like pipe input and output to running a command, it doesn't really care how it happens. So we were even kidding about like, we very likely won't do this, but we totally could just implement like GCE support, because in the way the interfaces are written, it doesn't really care about that. It just needs to be an exec thing. So like we could use SSH.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's abstracted such that, we've got a lot of options.
It pretty much just needs to be able to pipe things in and out of commands running on particular nodes. It needs to be able to list nodes, delete nodes, and it hands the like cluster config and says make it. And we have some utils to like help with that, but all it's doing in that is making the nodes exist in their unbootstrapped state. And then all the bootstrapping logic just takes the list of nodes and like runs commands on them. So we also currently expect the host name, et cetera, to match up, but we don't currently depend on doing something like asking a machine from inside the machine, like what is your host name? But we do sort of expect that like the containers are named, and we currently make the Kubernetes name and the container name and the host name the same because it's easier for users, and that makes sense in Docker. I don't think much would break. We care about the name that the provider tells us, but like that could be a mapping or something.
Something to keep a track of.
And that's just going to be something like a CryCuddle ls and some filtering on the output to only return like the ones matching that cluster, and that's a label. So like it should map pretty well because we're not leveraging much Docker specific, and we only have 1 or 2 Docker specific workarounds going around. Like again, you can tell kind I want this node to have these extra bind mounts, which is useful. Docker only accepts absolute paths, so like we have some logic to try to like relative path resolve, like, but all of the things that are like that are pretty much all pushed down into that like provision function, and it's up to the provider to say, I don't support this, or try to support any of the config fields, and all it's expected to do is succeed or not, and then you're expected to be able to like list the nodes live and then exec stuff. So it should be like it should be pretty doable against Crycodal or CTR or even some bespoke binary. Like, doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it would also mean it would be probably not a great idea, but doable to go like the Podman route and like write a fake Docker CLI or something. I think it would be much saner to just wrap that with a little bit of code in kind. What we do want to avoid, though, is something like importing the actual CRI for now, because it's stable and because we are in general avoiding picking up most dependencies. Kind is really easy to embed, and also for the purposes of testing Kubernetes, we don't have like dependency cycles. We only depend on like one library that actually comes from the Kubernetes repo, and that's just the version parser. And it's staged, so we're not depending on K8s directly, and while that does get periodically published by them, we're not super like, we don't expect changes to that code, and we wouldn't be super sensitive to them anyhow, and it would break everyone if like versions changed. So that one seems fine, but otherwise we avoid depending on core Kubernetes things in the main library, so that there isn't this like dependency cycle of like, how do we test the changes if we're also going to use them later. We do pull it in things that are not in the main binary, though. Like we have a network runtime for like really simple node-to-node networking that we run by default. That does actually use Kubernetes proper, but it's built in frequently, and it's a client, so it's not doing anything more than like listing nodes and finding out their IPAM. So again, like basically can't be broken, and it's like in a separate Go module and everything.
It's handy.
That may, I think so far that probably will even work, but if not, worst case, we'll just say like this provider uses different images, or maybe there's like a field where you say like don't turn on the default CNI. You could just say like with this provider you need to like, we require that is set to true, and we're going to like have you install like whatever you want, Calico or something.
Or like, we could ship and bundle our own with it and then refer to that.
Yeah, then it will have to use a different Docker image.
Sure, yeah, we would control all that.
I think it's actually even reasonably likely that the current one will work. It's not super exciting. It pretty much just uses netlink routes to say like this node has this pod CIDR. So if you want to reach any of these IPs, just go via that node IP. And otherwise it's doing very standard plugin stuff, host local IPAM, and like P2P for the local net. So like those should work anywhere.
Okay. Well, this is encouraging. I feel like there's like I said, there's a short term, like, we can wire it up if we pick Crycodal or CTR, and then work on a longer sort of a roadmap on the provider together.
Yeah, I actually don't expect a whole lot to need to change with the provider. I think it's going to wind up having to change when Kind changes what functionality we offer. Like, if we change like how we support loading images or something, we might want to like have more details about a provider. But I think at a pretty high level, the main thing that's going to change is the configuration that's being passed to the tool.
Okay.
But like the high level of like, here's a configuration, give me some like bare nodes that I can finish bootstrapping, has worked pretty well. And then everything after that is like, okay, I want to handle to a node so I can exec stuff to do the bootstrapping. Or okay, it's time to clean up, I'm going to delete the nodes now.
Yeah, yeah.
And here's the list of nodes I want to delete. And all of those require like being given an instance from the provider, so you can hide extra information inside the Go code there if you need. But currently, for the actual providers, we just have the name because that's sufficient. But like, if you wanted, since everything will actually go to your provider and make a list call before it does anything with a node, you can do whatever you need there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So like, I actually don't expect that to need to change too much. And I think if we can't accomplish this with like KraigCodel, then we have a real problem with like the ecosystem.
Sure. Yeah, that
Um,
makes sense.
and if not, also if you're specifically using um, Containerd, the Containerd API is really nice to work with, and they have their own client binary, which we actually use inside the nodes, and we've been pretty happy with that.
Yeah, so we shipped a tech preview of Fusion, and we had this thing called Project Nautilus, which is, how do we get containers to all work and whatnot. And part of that effort was, we have our own binary for Containerd. It's running inside of, our package and whatnot. We create a 9PFS storage and wire it all up. And so, yeah, I feel like the work that we've done to sort of get that support and that working, like I said, hopefully that sets us up so that we can take the next step here. And then I guess the end of the question is like, how can we give out and contribute something that's not just going to be for our own interests? I mean, like yeah, we want to get work in Fusion and Workstation, and that's cool. I kind of don't care about vSphere, but I don't want to just do this for our own sake. I think that there's a meta value here.
So if it's supporting like a standard API like Containerd or KraigCodel, KraigCodel is somewhat more generic, but I would be pretty fine with Containerd. If we get Containerd, that also opens us up to options in CI of considering like running against that as a lighter thing that starts faster, instead, like especially when we don't need to build the images and we don't expect to need Docker at some point for like the build steps. Then we can offer like say other teams or even some of like Kubernetes own usage to like try using some of these other ones. Another one that I want to do at some point is some VM type options for local developers to say like, okay, do that. Obviously want to avoid entirely being like a product, but having some validation there of like, what does this take will also be really useful to know, so that we can say, okay, if you want to go at your own, you can like figure out how to get like Kata working or something and wire it up. I expect that's going to be a lot more involved for users, and it won't be available on Mac. But I would like to be able to point to like, okay, you want to run a local one with like you like Kind, but you kind of need the isolation of VMs. I think we can still do it pretty fast, but we need like some VM integration. It looks like most of those things are going to be inevitably through Containerd, since it's just a like nice extensible container runtime.
It's pretty mature and well maintained.
Yeah, so like it looks like even if we say, okay, we want to do VMs with like Kata as an option, or I think even Ignite has rebased onto it, having something that's able to target Containerd one way or another is going to unlock that already for us. Like I think most of the work there is just going to be, can we target Containerd? And then we'll just probably need to do kind of like we did with the Podman and Docker one, and take that provider and fork it a little bit and say, okay, they share some utils, but like when we're using Fusion, we can support these options, and when we're using Kata, we have to support only these options. But like a huge amount of how does this work is going to be the same code, and probably we can actually factor it into the same code.
Nice.
So I actually just think that like implementing this will be useful, as long as it's like, I'd be willing to accept it, but it will be nice if it is like, Containerd API or something instead of like a Fusion API.
Yeah, like, and that's what I don't want, right? Like I definitely want to make sure that A, there's a dependency that isn't inherent to a commercial product, and B, like I said, I just don't, how do I put this? I mean, yeah, I manage this product and these product lines and whatnot, but I've been an open source guy since like 99, man. And like, I remember back in the day when, I needed help with like OpenBSD, and the only way to do that was to email Theo to Rat, right? Like, and he is awesome. And he was very helpful. Like, oh yeah, that's a total bug in PF. Here, take my, I fixed it. You get an advanced copy of it, whatever. And this, So for me, I've always had this altruistic, like, I ran a data center in Toronto for a little while and it was all on Gen 2 Linux. So, I like doing things the hard way. And it's just been a community that I've always wanted to give back to, but me not being, a strong engineer, we wrote this vcuddle thing. I kind of hacked together like the original command structure. And then I'm like, okay, guys, make these commands work now. And off they go. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think this is going to be pretty useful. I'm going to need to continue for the moment to focus on Docker. It's where we have a pretty good existing user base that needs helping. And right now I'm actually specifically looking at like increasing the tests we can run. But at some point I expect that there are modes of testing or development of Kubernetes itself where it's really going to make sense to use one of these alternative runtimes. Just keeping our options on the table, even though we kind of went in with the name. I've dropped most of the acronyms anywhere. Like, we're definitely not trying to be coupled to that. But what we are trying to do is avoid being coupled to any of them too bad. We're going to allow like a tiny bit here. I think we're going to have to leave an option to specify which Docker network you want once we start using one. And that will probably just be a field that basically every other provider is like, nope, don't set that. But
or handle it on your own if you're careful. Right?
Yeah, but some users are probably going to need to be able to set that. So we'll probably wind up having that one field that's somewhat Docker specific. Like, for most of the other providers, they're going to use CNI or something themselves, and it's not really going to make like, there isn't a network to pick. Like, it's the network. So I'm expecting to have to go into like, say, the Podman provider and just be like, it doesn't support this or something, or it behaves differently, but that's fine. Throw an error like it. I think we already expect that. And other than that, I really like that one's a bit of sticking point because it's going to really improve the behavior for most of our users. But if not for something like that, I think we can keep everything pretty generic. And we've even modeled the config where we can after like CRI types, like for the mounts or port forwards or something. They map pretty closely to them. They're not actually the upstream types, but they're like, you
Close
can
enough.
do it's pretty much just a like typecast to go from one to the other. So
that's cool. So I guess the other question that I would have is like, how do we help? Like, I've got a bunch of guys who are like, where do I start writing code?
oh yeah. I don't know. I think I've had this problem a lot. Everyone like wants to on this project because it's popular, but like, it's not a massive code base, and I'm active enough on it that like when some little bug comes up, I usually just squish it same day.
Sure.
So that has left like some kind of gnarly stuff that doesn't really need code so much as deciding how we're going to do it. Like the host reboot thing is one of the biggest sticking ones for people. I think I've actually got that now, but it's been entirely like, which terrible trade-off do we make here in terms of like, we need to muck around with the network and stuff. It's going to be weird. You're definitely not supposed to be using these things this way. How do we make this work? The actual changes are probably not going to be much code. Like the whole repo is like maybe like 10K lines or something. Like it has never been much code, and we've intentionally avoided that. It's been like, oh no, you're trying to like run Docker and Docker. What like awkward specific hacks do you need to employ to do that? I'm gonna try to come up with some more. I've got a teammate here that popped in and out of the call quietly that is in a similar boat, like wants to contribute more. And I've been like, here's an issue, but keeping the keeping them up enough has been hard, even with our like existing ones. So I'll definitely let you know if anything like obvious comes up, like, oh, here's something we're working on, like, or that we want that is outlined, but we're not working on. But mostly, a lot of the issues we get wind up not being kind issues. It's like people misunderstanding, like we're using Containerd as a runtime and they're expecting Docker, or like they don't yet understand Kubernetes, or things that are infeasible. Like people want load balancer support. It's like, sure. First go to Docker and get them to like allow us to reach containers via the RIPs, and then we'll do all kinds of cool things. And until then, like, you get port forwards because that's what Docker has. So
Yeah.
like even that one, like we've looked at like could we build some crazy hacky thing, but so far they're all so hacky that like
Falls a little bit outside of the scope, right?
yeah. So like there are things like that. Like there are definitely features that we still want that we are not working on, but that's because they seem somewhat infeasible, at least with the current backends. Like we like Docker on Linux, sure, but as soon as you get on Mac or Windows, you're the the networking restrictions really block us from building those last couple of things that people want. Um,
It could definitely be an area where we could really help. We have our own networking stack, and it's the way that we're kind of delivering container support right now. It's a little different than how Docker does it, but I can see where we can really help with that. But anyway,
yeah, I think the problem has been that like unfortunately like a lot of people are, oh, Docker's open source, but then they're using like the Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows, and
which
those
is
aren't,
not.
and the stuff they're doing with their network stack is restrictive, and we haven't found a way that we think is good to work around that. Really what I want is like I want to find who owns that and say, can you like add a tap adapter to your VM and everything will be great. And I like we could try to ship something like that in kind, but all the ones I've seen so far require something like modifying the Docker app, and that's not a patch I want to carry.
Well, yeah, and then you're, dealing with supporting it on all the different platforms, which are going to implement that very differently. And
Yeah, so there are things like that that are like, yeah, this would be great, and if someone comes up with it, fantastic. But so far, I'm fairly convinced that they're just not feasible.
mm,
We also have some fairly big incoming code that I'm discussing with back for now around like people want dual stack support. It's like, yeah, but
as in like two versions of Kate's running in two different clusters at the same
um
time.
IPv4, IPv6.
Oh, that dual stack.
But it's like in Kubernetes, this is barely a thing, and like I don't want to carry all of the mess while like no one else is willing to
Don't
yet.
do
Like,
that. Don't
like
don't do that.
let's wait and see if they can figure it out a little bit and get it in like one real cluster somewhere at all, and then maybe we'll put this in. So if anything, I've been like holding back some big ones because it's like, whoa, this is going to make massive changes and be a mess, and like the APIs aren't settled yet, and like no real clusters have this. Hmm,
Yeah.
yeah,
So how much do you need to test something that's not in a real cluster?
right. It's like, yeah, this code never runs in production. Is it real code?
If a tree falls in the forest, that's nice.
Yeah, yeah. But other than that, I think it's mostly just like feel like the most helpful thing that we've gotten, like, yeah, like a couple of VMware people actually, like Duffy has been hanging around and just sharing their expertise with all the users and stuff, and like
Mm,
fixing a bug here and there. But in terms of features, there's like most of them are related to testing Kubernetes, and like they're like I've mostly just been settling on the design. The like code is pretty small.
yeah.
A lot of the changes we wind up needing to make are actually in another project. Like I'm trying to get some changes to move along in Containerd and to fix a few things, or like Kubernetes itself. We've kept it pretty light.
Well, that makes sense, and I get that, and that kind of aligns with how I kind of assumed and figured this was going to go, which is, hey, well, propose an idea, there's this sort of abstraction on the CRI layer that we can all take advantage of, and then you guys and architects and whomever else can decide how do we actually want to do this, and then you'll come up to a plan like, okay, here's we think the way to do it, and as a result of that, a body of work will emerge.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we're gonna find we're going for there's a few more like open questions, like how does this relate to Minikube, which is also now implementing some of this stuff and even borrowing some things, and like whatnot. So we're mostly still focusing on like how do you test Kubernetes with this, and that mostly involves changes like in the Kubernetes tests.
Mm-hmm.
But we are like I do think that local dev is useful, and regardless of how that settles, people are going to be doing it, and I support teams with it. So
Mm-hmm.
um, there's a few things to shore up there, but honestly, one of the nice ones will be giving them some options other than Docker. So like I've just recently had my teammate work on like the Podman one, but I'm pretty happy to like pass off working on Containerd or something. It looks like we're gonna have him work on some other Kubernetes testing stuff entirely, like again with real clusters. So yeah, I
Okay.
look forward to PRs here, and I hope to see people around. Like one of the like I said, one of the most helpful things has just been we get tons of people coming in and they're like, oh, how do I X? And often it's just some small misunderstanding, but
Mm.
occasionally it is some like deep, gnarly bug.
And when they're coming in, are they coming in through Slack or GitHub issues or both?
Mostly Slack, but also GitHub issues.
Anywhere else?
We haven't taken to monitoring any other channels.
Yeah.
Like most of the people on this project, myself included, like part-time do it. There's other stuff. So like, we're not like quite ready to staff like a Stack Overflow rotation or something
Sure.
like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, come file an issue, or like, here's the Slack. Or also, there's like, we do mention like there's the mailing lists for like SIG testing and stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty rare that we see a question through there. Most of them are GitHub issues or Slack.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, it's interesting trying to find, even as an example of, ways that it could help. Just trying to find this meeting was tough. I had to get it from Duffy because I went to the Kubernetes community page and I'm like, is there a calendar here? Is there anything here?
There's like a YAML file in the community repo or something, but yeah, most of them, the easiest thing is if they have one in their Slack in the description, they have it. But yeah, like I said, I may very well fold this down and spin it into SIG testing. I'm trying to do more there again, and like we haven't had super high attendance to this meeting. We're doing most discussion through like other like
async means.
Yeah, like because like one of our larger contributors, Antonio, is like an engineering manager at SUSE in Spain. So like time zones, it's just easier to use more
Slack, email, whatever.
Time zone broad communication options.
Gotcha. Well, this has been super helpful. I think that answers a lot of what I wanted to discuss and get asked. I think we have a pretty good idea of some of the options ahead of us. We'll wait to hear some of the discussion. I've got a meeting a couple hours with Duffy later today, so we can go over some of this.
I think the biggest question is whether you want to do CTR or CryCuddle, and I'm not really sure, but either of them I'm going to be pretty happy to receive. So
yeah, and that's what I'm going to be talking about Duffy with. I'm not sure the implications of picking one or the other. So I want to make sure that we're sort of thinking about it. And
I think probably the biggest upshot to CryCuddle is that it's supposed to be intended for this, whereas like CTR is more like the container D guys saying like, okay, here's a tool. Like we have an API that you should use. Like here's a thing. But I think in practice, they're in a pretty similar space. And depending on what all you want to be able to do, the like CRI is a much more restrictive API. Like we actually, like, again, we don't do everything with CRI, even on the manipulating Kubernetes node levels, because we need to do some quirky stuff like load in images ahead of time. And like CRI doesn't have a concept of like loading an image because that doesn't make sense. For a real Kubernetes cluster, you can task it to pull and you can ask it to run something, but you can't say like, here's a tarball. Because that's up to your runtime. It's not something that Kubelet cares about. Like CRI is really the like, what does Kubelet need? So like you can probably pull it off with CryCuddle, and then it's broader support and things. And like CryCuddle is not something people should be breaking at all. I'm not sure where Containerd stance is on CTR. I think they probably can't afford to break it, but I'm not sure if they've actually committed to that. But like their overall API is much more expansive and granular and useful than CRI because it's not just what Kubelet needs.
CryCuddle, you mean, right?
Yeah, so like the CRI API. So
okay.
CryCuddle is going to be bound by what CRI can do, and CRI is just like what does Kubelet need.
Gotcha.
Whereas like Containerd has a much more thorough API.
Gotcha. So like if we were to like, for example, let's say, make things work and make that work against, CryCuddle or CTR, what would we need to deliver? Would it be just like our supporting that and then you install kind and then like there's a config where you're pointing it at our implementation of it?
Yeah, so like probably usually CryCuddle reads this like standard file on disk that says like, this is the endpoint I'm supposed to use and any other details. I don't think you normally set other ones, but I think there are other ones. CTR, I think, is much more likely to have like it just assumes the default one, but can be told to do other things. And it normally isn't configured. It's just used, and then you might do something like want to specify a namespace or something. I'm not sure how we'd want to plumb that through. I'd probably have some discussions with Duffy depending on which one you go with. Whereas Craig Cuddle is going to operate in the Kate namespace. I have a feeling that CTR may make more sense here. But in terms of like maximum neutrality or whatever, that's definitely Craig Cuddle.
Okay. That's good insight.
But like, if you think you can pull it off with either of them, I'm pretty fine with whichever one you want to support. I'm gonna like, I think most of what we're gonna wind up supporting with it is gonna be containerd based anyhow. I'm not sure how much sense it makes to like stand up cryo and then run kind against it. I think for most of the people that want like that ecosystem, Podman is probably what they actually want. And for most of our users, I expect it will continue to be Docker. But for a few people doing some more interesting stuff, they're probably going to want like the VM type things that are like, okay, containerd is a mechanism by which we run containers, but then we can do interesting implementations of containers. And for that, just targeting containerd is probably sufficient.
Okay.
So it's really down to like whichever one's going to like make more sense for like
the use case
or integration and maintaining this. And for Kind's perspective, it will just be another thing implementing the provider, execing some tool. And we may have to work out a little bit of like, oh, we need to plumb some extra details, but we could figure that out.
Okay. Digesting a lot of that.
Yeah. In general, I like something like CTR ideally shouldn't need that kind of config. You would expect to be able to like just go to your CLI and be like CTR or PS or something like that.
And it'll do the thing, yeah.
And it should just know where the thing is and do the thing.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Like all of these things are trying to sort of kind of be drop-in Docker replacements. So like we should be able to treat them as one. I'm sure in practice we might run into a little bit of fun there. We certainly do with Podman.
And we address those as we go, right?
Right. And some of those may very well be actual, like in Podman's case, most of them were actual bugs. But you know.
Sure. Okay. This recording, will it end up in a meeting notes somewhere so I can send it to some of my engineers?
It should. If it doesn't, we poke Aaron Krickenberger, SpiffXP.
Okay.
I don't think I have access to that, but it should wind up posted somewhere.
Okay. I'll follow up on it. Just want to make sure that some of my engineers hear the output of the discussion. That's all.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, thanks for coming, and look forward to collaborating on this.
No, I appreciate it, Ben. Nice to meet you in person finally.
Nice to see you.
Cheers.